Filipino and a different race, or kasi hindi tayo masyadong racially diverse. But in the US, for example, this interracial communication happens when an Asian American talks to a Black American, or a Hispanic American or a Latin American, say, talks with an Asian. Okay, these are identified races, and if you communicate with them, that's a form of interracial communication. Interethnic communication is the interaction with individuals of different ethnic groups. So, for us, it could be the Maranaos and, well, a Bicolano. Although a Bicolano is not an ethnic group. But because you're communicating to a person coming from an ethnic group, then it's also an interethnic communication. When you talk to somebody who is from the Kabihug tribe, that's an interethnic communication. International communication is communication between persons representing different nations. So, say you are working for an embassy and you're talking to the ambassador of Korea. That's a form of international communication. So, international communication really is more on politics, more on international policies. It really delves more into social political factors and the law. Intracultural communication is the interaction with members of the same racial or ethnic group or co-culture as yours. Now we'll talk about culture and co-cultures. Culture is a system of knowledge, beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that are required, shared, and used by members during daily living. Co-cultures, on the other hand, are groups of persons who differ in some ethnic or sociological way from the parent culture. Okay, here's an example. We have a parent culture, which is the Filipino culture. And from there, it can we can classify other cultures as Bicolano culture, Ilocano culture, Visayan culture, Mindanaoan culture, so on and so forth. Now, Bicolano and Ilocano are different cultures that stem from the more general and parent culture, which is the Filipino culture. So, Bicolano and Ilocano are co-cultures. Okay. Now, under Bicolano, you have, for example, the Nagueños, the Albayanos, the Rinconada culture. And these three are co-cultures coming from a parent culture, which is the Bicolano culture. Okay. The same way for Pangasinense and Ilocos Norte culture coming from the Ilocano culture. Strategies in interacting with members of the dominant culture. So we have definitely everywhere we have a dominant culture. There's some form of cultural imperialism everywhere, even locally. And in order to interact with members of the dominant culture, here are some ways that members from the lesser dominant culture interacts with them. The first is assimilation, which the means by which co-culture members attempt to fit in with members of the dominant culture. Okay. So what happens here is that they try to act in certain ways that are deemed acceptable by the dominant culture. Okay. So, for example, you invite them to lunch, or you eat what they eat. That's assimilation. Accommodation naman is the means by which cohort for members maintain their cultural identity while striving to establish relationships with members of the dominant culture. So this is, for example, uh, Filipino ka, and you migrated to Canada, and in Canada they only use forks, they don't use spoons. So for accommodation, what you do is while you eat lunch during your break, you invite some of your friends and you use your fork and your spoon, and then you allow them to see it, to watch you eat with it. And then sometimes you would bring them forks as well. So, okay, try to eat like a Filipino, blah, blah, blah. So, you maintain your cultural identity in a way that, okay, Filipino ako, gumagamit ako ng kutsara. And then you're teaching your friends, your newfound friends, that this is how we do it in our country or in our culture. That's accommodation. Separation is the means co-culture members use to resist interacting with members of the dominant culture. Separation is, you completely try to not interact with them. Or at the very least, you try to avoid it as much as possible. Don't try to... and this is done when you create your own group. This also happens in the classroom. You have different co-cultures there. You have, for example, let's say the parent culture is the CNSC culture. And under the CNSC culture, we have the College of Engineering culture. They have their own culture there. Then you have the culture here in the College of Arts and Sciences. And a lot of times, students would practice, even students and faculty actually, we would practice separation. As much as possible, we avoid interacting with them. Because they belong to a different world with different concerns. Parang ganon yung dating. And then, parang tayo din may different concerns, different world. Iba sa kas, iba sa koe. And so it's like, we separate ourselves from them. You don't have classes with them. You don't interact with them as much. Maybe some of you would be flirting with them, but in general, as students, you avoid one another. That's a form of separation. Okay. Approaches to communicating with co-cultures. Passive communication, or passive, is communication that do not attempt to interact with or have contact with those outside their own group. This is similar to separation. Assertive communication approach. Bakit may city dyan? May typo. Sorry. Realizes the objectives as well as meet the objectives of those with they interact. Okay. So, assertive in the sense that you still try to communicate with them. Ina-assert mo din yung kultura mo. So, you meet them halfway. This is my objective. I want you to learn my culture. And they as well would like you to learn their culture. And that's when assertive approach in communication happens. Aggressive communication approach are hurtfully expressive and self-promoting and attempt to control the choices the persons they are interacting with make. Ito yung mga tao na they're saying, like this news that broke several years ago about this child who was an immigrant, a Filipino immigrant in Canada. He forgot to bring his spoon for lunch, and so he asked the lunch lady for a spoon. Where can he get a spoon daw? Because he did not know that in Canada they only get forks. They only use forks. And so he got the kid got bullied for that. Like, you're in Canada, so do what the Canadians do. We don't use forks here. We don't use spoons here. And I think even the principal also said the same thing when the parents complained. And so that's why it became such a big news some years ago. Uh, that's a form of aggressive communication. Because the lunch lady as well as the principal, they wanted the child to practice what they were practicing as Canadians without any respect for the background of the child who was Filipino. Confrontational approach seek to make dominant culture members hear that, recognize them, and react to them by making it impossible for them to ignore their presence or pretend they do not exist. Yung mga rallies, especially in the US right now, yung Black Lives Matter, that's a form of confrontational approach. This can get very violent as well. Not just because, in the US it's happening. It can happen anywhere. In Egypt, this also happened. Where else? In the Philippines, not so much. Kasi hindi kultura ng mga Pilipino yung confrontational. Kaya ang daming backstabber na Pilipino. Ay, charot lang. Pero, yeah. Confrontational approach, it's more in your face. Example nga is yung pag-rally. That's a form of confrontational approach. This is the table, a summary. The different strategies, those are 3: separation, accommodation, assimilation, and the communication approach. Okay, so passive for separation. Accommodation is more assertive. And assimilation can be aggressive and confrontational. So, examples for separation passive: lunching alone, living in an area with similar people, okay, not getting along with others, or a conscious effort not to mingle with other cultural groups. Okay, basically. Accommodation assertive, wearing a yarmulke to work, wearing a sari to a party. Okay, yung mga swimsuits ngayon that's friendly for Muslim women, which covers everything. Okay, and it's not so tight, parang it's tight enough. Okay, those are form of accommodation assertive ways of communication. Kasi the way you dress, that's also a form of non-verbal communication. Your choices and the way we design clothes for certain people, that's a form of non-verbal communication as well. Assimilation, aggressive, confrontational. Like I said, rally, staging a protest, those are examples of that. Okay. You had a reading about culture guides communication. In the examples that I've already mentioned, it's very clear to see how our culture, our background, our beliefs affect how we communicate with people coming from different cultures, different set of beliefs. This is true for everyone. Even if you're such a great multiculturalist, sometimes you can still get it wrong. Okay. But yeah, culture guides communication. How you talk, how you mingle with other people, what you find offensive, those are part of your culture, part of your cultural identity, of what molded you into becoming who you are. So culture guides communication. And one of the concerns for culture and communication is the concepts of ethnocentrism, xenocentrism, and cultural relativism. Now, the reading states that cultural relativism is the exact opposite of ethnocentrism. But that's wrong. You can scratch that. That's wrong. The opposite of ethnocentrism is xenocentrism. Now, ethnocentrism is a tendency to see one's own culture as superior to others. Okay. While xenocentrism is a tendency to see one's own culture as inferior to others. But cultural relativism is the acceptance of other cultural groups as equal in value to one's own. So it's like ethnocentrism, Pinoy pride. Yeah, hashtag Pinoy pride. That's ethnocentrism. You think that your own culture is much better than the culture of others. Lumalabasan yung when we say na, ang mga Pilipino kasi we're conservative, we're religious, or when we say that Filipinos are more welcoming to people or guests. Okay? Concept ng mga Pinoy, masyadong mabait. Okay, that's a form of ethnocentrism. Xenocentrism, yun yung lagi nating dinadown yung ating sariling kultura. Mga Pinoy kasi ganito, ganito. Sa Pilipinas kasi makalat, ganyan. Okay. Cultural relativism, we accept that different cultural groups, we are all equal in value. Ang kulturang Pinoy is as important and as beautiful as American culture or say the French culture. Pare-parehas tayo niyan, even if we have different cultures and the different histories and all that. If you're a cultural relativist, then you see that all of these are equal. Okay. So, sabi